welcome to all people who have decided to join my talk. If you're listening live, you're a real one, you're based as hell. If you are listening in the form of a recorded format, then yeah, whatever, sure, cool. So, the topic of the day is China's socialist market economy. Is it socialist? To preface, right, in case there are any Maoists or ultra leftists or anarchists listening, and you don't want to hear my dengest opinion, I'm gonna say yes, it is socialist. So if you don't want to hear me be a CPC shill, quote unquote, you can click off this video right away and go, I don't know, boil some babies or whatever the hell you can Conzalites do in your free time. I'm gonna start with the ideological justification. The ideological justification of the socialist market economy. So the ideological justification behind China's economic reforms, at least according to Deng Xiaoping, was that the primary contradiction was how to build socialism with underdeveloped productive forces. The answer was partly inspired by the new economic policy of Lenin and the USSR, which I'll go into later. The goal is essentially to modernize and develop the productive forces while maintaining a socialist relations of production and ensuring that the productive forces can grow and become stronger. Marx also talked about this, which I'll go into. So, essentially, the nature of the country determines the nature of the relationship between the government and the market. The state has dual attributes, right? One is a violent tool of class rule. The other is an organ that safeguards public interests. But in essence, the state's attributes of safeguarding public interest must be subordinated to its class attribute. The productive forces can grow and become stronger. Marx also talked about this, which I'll go into. Essentially, the nature of the country determines the nature of the relationship between the government and the market. The state has dual attributes, right? One is a violent tool of class rule. The other is an organ that safeguards public interests. But in essence, the state's attributes of safeguarding public interest must be subordinated to its class attribute. Because the state protects public interest, it is only the ruling class that has to use the state machinery to regulate different stakeholders within the scope of society in order to protect its own interests. And fundamentally speaking, it must obey the ruling class's interests. The nature of the government as the country's governing and social management agency is clearly determined by the nature of the country. The government undertakes the country's economic, political, and social management functions. So, when it comes to a bourgeoisie state, right? On the one hand, the bourgeoisie state does its best to safeguard the free development of capital from an institutional perspective. On the other hand, it must play a role in participating in social and economic activities. It creates the conditions for private monopoly capital to obtain high monopoly profits. When the government as an economic subject participates in the process of social production and reproduction, once it conflicts with the interest of private capital owners will use parliament or the Congress or whatever kind of bourgeoisie agency to put pressure on the government and ask the government to withdraw from the market. This fully reflects the capitalist countries participate in economic activities of economic entities, and its fundamental purpose is to create economic conditions for private capital to maximize profits. However, China implements the socialist system, and the country also has dual attributes, but it is fundamentally different from the nature of a capitalist country. Because the Chinese government has not only become the manager and participant of social public affairs and social economic activities, but also the representative of the fundamental interests of the broad masses of the people and the defender of a socialist system. So, one example of this is how the Chinese state undergoes macro control of the economy, but it also directly participates in the production and reproduction activities of the national economy as the owner of the ownership by the whole people. The understanding of the relationship between the Chinese government and the market must not only stop at the level of big government and small market, or small market and big government, but must also go deep into the essential level of the relationship between the country and the market. Only in this way can you understand Chinese socialism and the Chinese economy. The Chinese constitution stipulates in Chapter 1, Article 6 and 7, the basis, begin quote, the basis of the socialist economic system of the People's Republic of China is the socialist public ownership of the means of production, that is, ownership by the whole people and collective ownership by the working masses. Socialist public ownership eliminates the system of exploitation of others and implements the principle of each according to his ability and distribution, each according to his work. At the primary stage of socialism, a country adheres to the basic economic system in which public ownership is the mainstay and multiple forms of ownership develop together, and it adheres to the distribution system in which distribution according to the work is the mainstay and multiple forms of distribution coexist. The state-owned economy, that is, the socialist economy owned by the whole people, is the leading force in the national economy. The state guarantees the consolidation and development of the state-owned economy. Now, how does the CPC do this, right? Because everyone's like, oh, CPC, state capitalists, macro control. You see, the stupid argument. I'm going to explain to you why the argument is stupid, okay? So, a good example of this is how China dealt with the 2008 financial crisis. The test came when the Chinese leadership was forced to deal with the effects of the worst capitalist crisis since World War II. When the crisis hit in 2008 to 2009, many tens of millions of workers in the US, Europe, Japan, and across the capitalist world were plunged into unemployment. China, which exported to the capitalist West, was faced with the shutdown of thousands of factories primarily in the eastern coastal provinces and especially economic zones. So, how did China deal with this? According to Nicholas Lardy from the prestigious Peterson Institute for International Economics, goes into how actually consumption went up during the 2008 and 2009 crisis and how the Chinese government created sufficient jobs to cover for the layoffs. In a year in which GDP expansion in China was the slowest in almost a decade, how could consumption growth in 2009 have been so strong in relative terms? How could this happen at a time when unemployment in export oriented industries was collapsing, with a survey conducted by the Ministry of Agriculture reporting the loss of 20 million jobs in export manufacturing centers along the southern coast, notably in Guangdong province? The relatively strong growth of consumption in 2009 can be explained by several factors. First, the boom in investment, particularly in construction activities, appears to have generated additional employment sufficient to offset a large portion of the jobs lost in the export sector. For the year as a whole, the Chinese economy created 11.02 million jobs in urban areas, very nearly matching 11.13 million urban jobs created in 2008. Second, while the growth of employment slowed slightly, wages continued to rise. In nominal terms, wages in the formal sector rose 12%, a few percentage points below the average of the previous 5 years. In real terms, the increase was almost 13%. Third, the government continued its programs of increasing payments to those drawing pensions and raising transfer payments to China's lowest income residents. Monthly pension payments for enterprise retirees increased by renminbi of 120 or 10%. In January 2009, substantially more than 5.9% increase in consumer prices in 2008. This raised the total payment to retirees by about 75 billion renminbi. The Ministry of Civil Affairs raised transfer payments to about 17 billion of Chinese lowest income citizens by a third, for an increase of renminbi billion in 2009. So, income went up, consumption went up, unemployment was overcome in China. While the capitalist world was still mired in mass unemployment, recession, stagnation, slow growth, and increasing poverty, the reversal of the effects of the crisis in China is a direct result of the CPC state planning, state-owned enterprise, and state-owned banking. There was a crisis in China, and it was caused by the world capitalist crisis. The question was, which principle would prevail in the face of such a crisis? The principle of socialism or of capitalism? In China, socialism won. It is clear from the way the Chinese leadership handled this crisis that the socialist economic foundation and the socialist superstructure is still dominant in China. To give a quick summary, China state does stuff that socialist state does. Wage go up, job go up. Everyone happy. Crisis? averted. So this is the second point I'm going for. The nature of ownership determines the substantive content of the plan and market in the allocation of resources. The relationship between the plan and the market is an important aspect of the relationship between the government and the market. To understand the relationship between these two entities at a deeper level, one cannot avoid the relationship between planning and how it affects the market. In actual economic activities, neither planning nor market can exist abstractly, but embedded in certain production relations. Therefore, the government's use of planning or market means to regulate the economy implies that people under a certain social economic system. Adjustment of the relationships between interests. The capitalist market economy is established on the basis of capitalist private ownership. Capital dominates the relations of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. The market mechanism and the law of value. To be precise, the law of production prices or the law of monopoly prices have become the regulators of the material interests of the various classes. The basis of this is how individual capital within microenterprises try their best to use careful planning and follow the law of proportional labor distribution to optimize resource allocation, while in the social context, capitalists use market mechanisms and value laws to achieve the survival of the fittest through competition. The planned production of individual capitalist enterprises has continuously increased productivity. At the same time, the anarchy of production has continuously formed a periodic economic crisis. The capitalist mode of production forces every enterprise to practice economy, but its anarchic competition system has caused the greatest waste of social production and material labor, and has produced countless indispensable, but it is superfluous in it of itself. In regards to how China deals with the question of quote unquote macro control, right? People will say, oh, but what about capitalists? Don't capitalists have macro control? This is true. However, it should be pointed out that the macro control of capitalist countries is an afterthought. The government acts as a firefighter to extinguish the economic cycle or crises created by private capital. Capitalist countries control infrastructure, high-tech industries carry out planning and investment. But the nature of capitalist countries determine that governments must put the protection of interests of private capital first. Sometimes, the open-mindedness that capitalists show to national plans or plans in general is just a passive concession that they have to make temporarily in the face of the effects of objective economic laws and social pressure. The socialist system is based on the public ownership of the means of production, and the fundamental purpose of production is to meet the needs of the people. There is a fundamental difference between bourgeoisie political economy and Marxist political economy, and this difference has also generated unavoidable disputes. The essence of a dispute, as Engels points out, is supply and demand are the formulas according to which the logic of the bourgeoisie judges all human life. The controversy between social production guided by social foresight, which constitutes the essence of the political economy of the working class. Of course, this is from the nature of the socialist plan. China's national conditions determine that we implement a socialist market economy, and the market plays a decisive role in the allocation of resources. However, the characteristics of the socialist market economy are a great initiative towards China. According to Xi Jinping, developing a market economy under conditions of socialism is a great initiative of our party. A key factor for the great success of our country's economic development is that we have given full play to both strengths of the market economy and the advantages of the socialist system. We are developing a market economy under the premise of the leadership of the Communist Party of China and a socialist system, and the attributive socialism must never be forgotten. The organic combination of the socialist system and the market economy is a combination of planning and the market. Compared to the capitalist market economy, the socialist market economy has obviously institutional advantages in the use of economic planning. This is due to the following 2 points. The first, the public ownership provides an institutional basis for planning adjustment. China adheres to a market economy with public ownership as the mainstay and state owned economy as the leading factor. The state owned economy is essentially a process in which the state participates in the production and reproduction of the national economy as a market subject. Although in the form of realization, state owned enterprise appears independent market entities. However, it does not deny that state owned enterprise and state owned economy belong to the nature of production relations under the ownership of the whole people. The country can use the power of the state owned economy to consciously plan the development direction of the national economy, establish a reasonable economic structure, limit, or even eliminate economic fluctuations caused by the spontaneity and blindness of the market. An example of this would be how Chinese wages, after adjusted for inflation, continue to grow, and how China doesn't experience boom or bust cycles. Second, the nature of the socialist country determines the planning adjustment is the fundamental goal of meeting the needs of the people. Capitalist country also have plans for planning, but because capitalist countries represent the interests of the bourgeoisie, the fundamental purpose of capitalist production is to maximize profit. Therefore, only those plans that conform to the interests of capitalists can be implemented, and they are important to the people's livelihood. Plans that are good but are not good for capitalists often become gimmicks for political parties to get votes during elections. After a party that has received popular support comes to power, it will be greatly reduced when it is actually implemented. National plans are based on, in China at the very least, are based on people-centered approach, safeguarding social fairness and justice, ensuring the people's right to equal participation and equal development, and achieving developmental results, more and fairer benefits towards all the people. Example of this would be the five development concepts, the 5-1 overlayout, the four comprehensives, the 13th fifth-year plan, and the two centenary goals put forward by the Communist Party of China fully reflect the country's top-level design and macro planning, playing a leading role in realizing the fundamental interests of the broad masses of the people. The four modernizations and the liberation of the productive forces. In early 1963, at a meeting in Shanghai, Zhou Enlai proposed, if we want to build a powerful socialist country, we must modernize agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology. This became known as the Four Modernizations. Yet, this was by no means the first occasion at which modernization, or indeed their numbering, was mentioned, for both Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong have been developing the idea since the 1950s. We can clearly see this in the Great Leap Forward and the Chinese space program, which were in line with this development. According to Zhou Enlai, the goal of socialism was to improve the people's material welfare and cultural life. China's economy is very backward. Unless we establish powerful modern industry, modern agriculture, modern communications and transport, and a national modern defense, we will neither shake off backwardness and poverty nor retain our revolutionary goals. The sole aim of a socialist economy is to satisfy the people's material and cultural needs. This belief was in line with Marx, who stated in the book The German Ideology, we shall, of course, not take the trouble to enlighten our wise philosophers by explaining to them that the liberation of man is not advanced a single step by reducing philosophy, theology, substance, and all the trash to self-consciousness, and by liberating man from the domination of these phrases, which have never held them in thrall. Nor will we explain to them that it is only possible to achieve real liberation in the real world and by employing real means, that slavery cannot be abolished without the steam engine and the mill and spinning jenny. Serfdom cannot be abolished without improved agriculture, and that, in general, people cannot be liberated as long as they are unable to obtain food and drink, housing and clothing in adequate quality and quantity. Liberation is a historical and not a mental act, and it is brought about by historical conditions, the development of industry, commerce, agriculture, and the condition of intercourse. This is cited in The Precondition of the Real Liberation of Man, Part 1, Feuerbach, Opposition of the Materialist and Idealist Outlook B, The Illusion of the Epoch, German Ideology, Karl Marx. He also goes into detail in the same book where he says, thus things that have come to such a pass that the individuals must appropriate the existing totality of the productive forces, not only to achieve self-activity, but also merely to safeguard their very existence. This appropriation is first determined by the object to be appropriated, the productive forces, which have been developed to a totality and which only exist within a universal intercourse. From this aspect alone, therefore, this appropriation must have a universal character corresponding to the productive forces and the intercourse. This appropriation is further determined by the persons appropriating. Only the proletarians of the present day, who are completely shut off from all self-activity, are in a position to achieve a complete and no longer restricted self-activity, which consists in the appropriation of a totality of the productive forces and in the thus postulated development of a totality of capacities. All early revolutionary appropriations were restricted individuals whose self-activity was restricted by a crude instrument of production and a limited intercourse, appropriated this crude instrument of production, and hence merely achieved a new state of limitation. Their instrument of production became their property, but they themselves remained subordinate to the division of labor and their own instrument of production. In all expropriations up to now, a mass of individuals remained subservient to a single instrument of production. In the appropriations by the proletarians, a mass of instruments of production must be made subject to each individual and property to all. Modern universal intercourse can be controlled by individuals, therefore only when controlled by all. What did Marx mean by this? In this context, he is referring to how the restrictions and the lack of the development of the productive forces merely achieved limited socialism. That the revolutionary appropriation would be limited and merely a new state of limitation or a crude state of production. If the productive forces are not fully developed or fully emancipated or given full play to development to strengthen socialism, socialism will become limited and stagnate. This will also inevitably limit workers' emancipation. We can see in the modern example of how under socialism, we could theoretically use mechanization to decrease working hours and increase worker safety. Developing and advancing the productive forces, socialism will be unable to reach its goal of communism, which is to say, socialism will fail in its ultimate goal. We can clearly see that Marx believed that the role of the productive forces and the material enrichment of society was a de facto requirement to achieve socialism proper. Another interesting quote here is from Lenin, from the New Economic Policy and the Task of the Political Education Department, report to the Second All-Russia Congress of Political Education Department, October 17, 1921. Get down to business, all of you. You will have capitalists beside you, including foreign capitalists, concessionaries, and leaseholders. They will squeeze profits out of you amounting to hundreds%. They will enrich themselves operating alongside you. Let them. Meanwhile, you will learn from them the business of running the economy, and only when you do that, you will be able to build up a communist republic. Since we must necessarily learn quickly, any slackness in this respect is a serious crime. We must undergo this training, this severe, stern, and sometimes even cruel training, because we have no other way out. We must remember that our land is impoverished after many years of trial and suffering, and there's no socialist France or socialist England as neighbors, which could help us with their highly developed technology and their highly developed industry. Bear that in mind. We must remember that at present, all their highly developed technology and their highly developed industry belong to the capitalists who are fighting us. Lenin understood that the USSR lacked the advanced technology of the capitalist West which was needed to find a way to build up a communist republic, alongside creating highly developed technology and industry. This logic was the same as when Deng voiced his support for modernization. However, the Gang of Four that opposed Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping rejected this concept, leading Deng to criticize them, to say that they upheld poor socialism. To quote Deng, we have criticized on both a theoretical and a practical level the phony ultra-left socialism pushed by the Gang of Four, which boils down to universal poverty. Turning to Deng Xiaoping, it is striking how his renewed emphasis on the foreign modernization is in marked continuity with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong from the 1950s. We can discuss an example of the 43 plan implemented by Mao Zedong. To do a quick caveat into the 43 plan, the first economic reforms in China took place in 1972 with the implementation of the 43 plan proposed by Zhou Enlai. Roughly 4.24 billion US dollars worth of financial investment from over 20 countries, from capitalist nations, I might add, primarily Japan and the USA. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, premier of the State Council, initiated a new wave of importing advanced foreign technologies and equipment in 1972. After one of Mao's service staff told Mao that she queued for hours to buy some Dacron fabric, Mao had a conversation with Zhou about buying Western technologies for producing chemical fibers. Zhou Enlai then instructed the State Council Working Group and the State Planning Commission to prepare a report on importing chemical fibers and chemical fertilizer producing equipment. The report on importing complete set of chemical fibers and chemical fertilizers producing equipment proposed to import 4 complete sets of chemical fiber producing equipment with capacity of 240,000 tons, 2 complete sets of 300,000 tons synthetic ammonia producing equipment, and spare parts, steel for construction, one for the renovation of other chemical fertilizer factories, with a budget of 400 million US dollars. Zhou and Mao approved the plan in February of 1972. We can clearly see here that Chairman Mao actually did care about the productive forces and was going to do market reforms, and in fact, he did. The 43 plan included 26 projects to buy 7 petrochemical complexes for producing chemical fibers and plastics, as well as chemicals, 30 chemical fertilizer plants with a production to produce 4 million tons of ammonia and 6 million tons of urea, 3 power stations with a total capacity of 870,000 kilowatts, and 1 steel rolling plant with a capacity of 2 million tons, 1 chlorinated pellet plant for iron and steel production with a capacity of 300,000 tons, and 1 alkyl benzene plant with a capacity of 100,000 tons. It also included 43 sets of fully mechanized coal mining machines and many other machines for various industrial sectors. The proposed imports were completed, and, and many other machines for various in many other. Damn, I got confused. Give me a second. The proposed imports were completed, with the chemical fibers, fertilizers, and electricity produced by these plants and factories played a key role in meeting the demand for clothes, food, and electricity in the early 1980s. Hua Guofeng also implemented a similar policy in known as the 82 Plan, which only differed really from Mao Zedong's plan in amount. However, an interesting fact to note, Deng Xiaoping was not involved with the State Council Working Group, a part of the 43 and 82 Plan. So, Deng isn't a political mastermind that somehow maneuvered his way through the party, hoodwinked Mao, hoodwinked Hua Guofeng, and single-handedly destroyed the CPC from within. Sadly, Deng Xiaoping, as much as I would like him to be, is not that much of a political genius. So, I will try to stop coping. Socialism's superiority to capitalism is demonstrated in how it can improve the quality of life for people. I mean, I don't think I need to address the whole poverty getting reduced, how everything's made in China, the fucking cyberpunk 2050 Chinese cities. I think everyone listening and the people who's going to be listening to this recording already know China, at least in some aspects, have very advanced and materially enriched lives. Even though there is a rural, much more poor section in the West in China, this is still being remedied. Full electrification was completed in 2014. Water sanitation has increased. So the gap between the rural productive forces and the quality of life and the urban productive forces quality of life was actually closing, right? So simply to say that China ignored or somehow ignores rural development is cope. It's not how it works. As outlined, the people live an enriched cultural life. Poverty is not socialism. Where does Marx or Lenin say you have to be broke? Where? Someone find me where being poor is prerequisite of being socialist. Like who says this? Like where? Yeah, exactly. No one. No one says this unless you're an idiot, I guess. But Marx didn't say this. Lenin didn't say this. Mao didn't say this. The socialist market economy put out by Deng is merely continuing Mao and Zhou's legacy of deepening the liberation of the productive forces and improving the living standards of its people. This is China's socialist essence. According to Huang Nansen, how the socialist market economy serves the people and fulfills the requirement of China's socialist essence is as follows. Point 1. The system contains a multiplicity of components, but public ownership remains the core economic driver. Point 2. While both state owned and free market enterprises must be viable, their main purpose is not profits at all costs, but social benefit and meeting the needs of the people. In short, people centered. Point 3. It deploys the old socialist principle of from each according to ability and each according to work, limiting exploitation and wealth polarization and seeking common prosperity. The guide for action has to always remain Marxist and has to be Marxism. And fifth, the primary value should always be socialist collectivism rather than individualism. The socialist market economy is the method of resolving the primary contradictions of China during its implementation. The Chinese Revolution in 1949 was a tremendous achievement for the international communist movement. Led by Mao Zedong, the Communist Party of China immediately charted on a course of socialist reconstruction and an economy ravaged by centuries of dynastic feudalism and imperial subjugation from both Europe and Japan. Well, China isn't really feudal, but looks sounds cool when I read it out loud like it, doesn't it? Anyways, the CPC launched an incredible campaign designed at engaging the masses in constructing socialism and building an economy that could meet the needs of China's giant population. One can never overstate the incredible achievements of the Chinese masses during this period. The average life expectancy in China went from 35 in 1949 to 63 by Mao's death in 1976. Despite the vast social benefits bought by the CPC and after the revolution, China's productive forces still remain grossly underdeveloped and left the country vulnerable to economic decline. Deng outlined in the speech uphold the four cardinal principles. First, we are starting from a weak base. The damage inflicted over a long period by the forces of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism has reduced China to a state of poverty and backwardness. He says, while he grants that since the founding of the People's Republic, we have achieved signal successes in economic construction and established a comprehensive industrial system. However, Deng says China is still one of the world's poorest countries, and he states that when production is insufficiently developed, it poses serious problems with regards to food, education, and employment. We must greatly increase our efforts in family planning, but even if the population does not grow for a number of years, we will still have a population problem for a certain period. Our vast territory and rich natural resources are big assets, but many of these resources have not yet been surveyed and exploited, so they do not constitute actual means of production, despite China's vast territory. The amount of arable land is limited, and neither this fact nor the fact that we have a large, mostly peasant population can be easily changed. Deng continues the necessity of re-examining China's method of economic organization. As he outlines in the speech, the working class should make outstanding contributions to the foreign modernization. He says, since its goal is to transform the present backward state of our productive forces, it inevitably entails many changes in the relations of production, the superstructure and the forms of management in industrial and agricultural enterprises, as well as changes in the state administration over these enterprises so as to meet the needs of modern large-scale production. To accelerate economic growth, it is essential to increase the degree of specialization of enterprises, to raise the technical level of all personnel significantly and train and evaluate them carefully, to greatly improve economic accounting in the enterprise. Therefore, it is essential to carry out major reforms in the various branches of the economy with respect to the structure and organization as well as their technology. The long-term interests of the whole nation hinge on these reforms, without which we cannot overcome the present backwardness of our production, technology, and management. Since the implementation of the socialist market economy, China has experienced unprecedented economic expansion, growing faster than every country in the world. Deng's socialist market economy decisively lifted the Chinese masses out of systemic poverty and established the country as an economic giant whose power arguably exceeds the largest imperialist economies of the West. I'm going to divert a little bit and talk about what reform and opening up has actually achieved. I'm going to be focusing more on the broader social aspects, less so the military aspect, blah, 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 and its, social implication. So, first off, obviously, poverty reduction. From the beginning of reform and opening up for 改革开放, this is the, post 1978 economic reforms China, up to 2022, poverty has been reduced significantly. The number of people living below the poverty line, 1.90 US dollars a day, had fallen by around 800 million people. China has contributed to around 75% of the world's total poverty reduction. The rural poverty rate declined from 97.5% to 1.7%. By 2020, absolute poverty was eliminated in China, being the first country to reach the UN goal of no absolute poverty. From 1981 to 2015, China's poverty rate declined from 88% to 0.7%. When discussing relative poverty of 2.5 USD or below a day from 1981 to 2019, 91.62% declined to 0.14%, and less than 3.65 US dollars a day fell from 2.15 to 0.14. And in regards to discussing relative poverty of 6.85 US dollars or below a day from 1981 to 2019 fell from 99.98% to 24.72%. In terms of food security in China rose on the Global Food Security Index from 2012 to 2022 from 55 to 74.2. China is ranked 25th out of 113 countries on overall score, placing it in the top 20%. China is ranked second out of 113 countries on food availability, 33rd on food affordability, the top 29%, 46 on food safety, the top 40%, and 55th on sustainability and adaptation, top 48%. In 2022, China's prevalence of undernourishment is at 2.5% compared to the global average of 9.8%. 4.7% of children are stunted compared to the global average of 22%. China's rate of underweight children is 2.4%, while the global average of 2021 is 2.6%. China's rate of obesity compared to the global average is 6.6% compared to 13%. China has had a 100% positive change in food costs compared to the mean index of 78%. 100% positive change in food safety net programs compared to a mean of 72.4%. A score of 78.9 compared to the mean of 57.6 of access to agricultural input farmers. A score of 98.6 for food volatility compared to the mean of 68.7. A score of 69.3 for supply chain infrastructure compared to a mean of 61.9. A score of 100 for commitment to input food security policies compared to the mean of 47. A protein quality of 83.8 compared to the mean of 68.5, and a food safety of 92.4 compared to the mean of 76.4. And if we were to look at GDP growth, according to the study of the National Bureau of Economic Research, reforms yielded a significant growth in structural transformation differential. GDP growth is 4.2 percentage points higher, and the share of the labor force in agriculture is 23.9 percentage points lower compared to the continuation of pre-1978 policies. Unlike shock therapy, which was the mass privatization in the Eastern Bloc, the Eastern Bloc saw declines of 13%, 65% in GDP at the beginning of their reforms. Chinese growth has continued to remain strong. China also managed to avoid the hyperinflation of 200 to 1,000% that Eastern Europe experienced. Chinese GDP growth since 1978 to 2021 averages around 9%. From 1978 to 2017, China's GDP increased by 33.5 times at constant prices, with an average annual growth rate of 9.5%, doubling every 8 years on average. China has had the greatest economic growth out of any nation on planet Earth within a 39-year period. skyrocketing it to become the second largest economy just behind the United States of America. And if we are to look at GDP per capita, wage growth, and household consumption growth, from 1978, the GDP per capita skyrocketed from 156 US dollars to 12,556 US dollars by 2022, more than 55 times increase. For the period of 1978 to 2005, China's GDP per capita increased from 2.7 to 15.7% of US GDP per capita, and from 53.7% to 188.5% of Indian GDP per capita. Per capita incomes grew at 6.6% a year. Chinese wages increased sixfold between the period of 1978 and 2005. In advanced G20 economies, real wage growth fluctuated between 0.4 and 0.9%, while rising more rapidly between 3.5 and 4.5% annually. Between 2008 and 2019, real wages more than doubled in China, increased at 18% on average per year. Richard D. Wolff, in his video Economic Update, China's Economic Record and Strategy from 838 to 12.51, demonstrates that the real wage in China, i.e., the wage adjusted for the prices you pay, has gone up 4 times in the past 25 years, more than any other country. This is staggering considering that the most populous country on the planet. The US real wage, by comparison, is lower in 2019 than it was in 1973. And once you account for disposable income, it has increased 1,000% within 2002 and 2032. When it comes to water sanitation treatment, prior to the early 1980s, China lacked a proper municipal wastewater plant, which was first constructed in Nanjing. Subsequently, China engaged in what is possibly the largest wastewater treatment investment program in history. It has been estimated that in 2006 there was sufficient capacity to treat 52% of municipal residential wastewater. By 2010, that number increased to 77.5%. Between 1990 and 2012, access to improved water supply increased from 67 to 92%, and improved sanitation went from 24 to 65%. From 2006 to 2021, urban sewage treatment jumped from 55.7 to 97.8%. 77% of the population has gained access to improved sanitation since 1990, while 40% of the population has gained access to improved drinking water over the same period of time. By 2015, 76% of the population has access to improved sanitation, and 95% of the population has access to improved drinking sources. Access to basic sanitation from 2020 to 2020 had increased from 57 to 92%. In the same period of time, rural sanitation increased from 45 to 85%, and urban sanitation increased from 78 to 95%. But when it comes to electrification and literacy, by 1980, roughly only 70% of the population had full electrical coverage, which in 2015, China became the first large developing economy to achieve full electricity access. To underestimate China's success in providing 900 million people between 1949 and today stands out numerically the most impressive achievement in the history of electrification. China has addressed rural electrification on two distinct waves of effort. The first, which was synonymous with economic development of the country, which ran through the late 1990s and resulted in China enabling electricity service to 97% of the population. About 4/5 of the rural population gained access through extension of the power grid, while the rest were electrified by interconnecting small hydro and small sub-50 megawatt coal-fired plants into local and regional grids. The second front of effort to provide electricity for the last 3% was much harder, and offers perhaps the greatest lesson of relevance to other countries that are struggling to send electricity to remote poor populations. In this end, the end game for remote rural electrification, China has made notable advances by extending and renovating rural grids. But grid extensions could not reach everyone in a cost-effective manner, which is why in 2012, the central government released electricity for all 3-year action plans, outlined a plan to assure electricity supply for the last 2.73 million people. Success on this last front is what had allowed China to declare full electrification in 2015. China's literacy rate also increased from 65% in 1982, jumping up to 97.15% by 2022. When it comes to industrialization and automation, China is now one of the world's biggest producers of concrete, steel, ship, and textiles, and has the world's largest automobile market. Chinese steel output quadrupled between 1980 and 2000, and from 2000 to 2006 rose from 128.5 million tons to 418.8 million tons. Labor productivity at some Chinese steel firms exceeds Western. From 1975 to 1992, Chinese automobile production rose from 139,800 to 1.1 million, rising to 9.35 billion in 2008. Light industries such as textiles saw an even greater increase. Chinese textile exports increased from 4.6% of world exports to 24 in 1980 to 24.1% in 2005. Chinese robotic installations have also been growing rapidly, becoming world leader in robotics in 2019, the fastest growth in robotic installation out of any country. By 2016, China has become the largest operational stock of robots. Even when compared to the USA, a supposed first world developed economy, Chinese robot density, robots there are per 10,000 workers, outpaces them. China's commitment to automation can be seen in the rural sector, such as intelligent greenhouses with more commitment to roboticizing the farming industries. With mechanization rates in urban sectors at around 70% by 2020, the number is bound to increase. And lastly, but keep in mind, these are not the only benefits. I just listed the benefits that I believe would be most impactful to improving the material quality of the people, their material enrichment of their lives. So, lastly, high-speed railways. The high-speed railway network in the PRC is the world's longest and most extensively used, a total length of 42,000 kilometers by the end of 2022. The high-speed rail network of China encompasses newly built rail lines of a design speed of 200 to 350 kilometers an hour. Chinese high-speed rail accounts for two-thirds of the world's total high-speed railway networks. Almost all high-speed rail tracks, trains, and services are owned and operated by the China Railway Corporation under the brand China Railway High Speed. According to Martin Razor, World Bank country director for China, says, quote, China has built the largest high-speed railway network in the world. The impacts go beyond the railway sector and include changed patterns of urban development, increases of tourism, and promotion of regional economic growth. Large numbers of people are now able to travel more easily and reliably than ever before. And the network has laid the groundwork for future reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. End quote. The study, China's High-Speed Rail Development by Lawrence Martha B. Bullock, Richard G. and Liu Ziming, states the following. Key enabling factor of the success of the Chinese high-speed railway program is the development of a comprehensive long-term plan to provide a clear framework for the development of the system. China's medium and long-term railway plan looks up 15 years ahead and is complemented by a series of 5-year plans. In China, high-speed rail service is competitive with road and air transport of distances up to about 1,200 kilometers. State planning for China's current high-speed railway networks began in the early 1990s under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, who set up what became known as the high-speed rail dream after his visit to Japan in 1978, where he was deeply impressed by the Shinkansen, the world's first high-speed rail system. In the 1980s, China's railways also faced the dilemma of insufficient transportation capacity. The speed of trains was lower than 120 kilometers per hour, and the contradiction between passenger and cargo running mixing increased. According to the analysis of the relevant experts from the former China Ministry of Railway Research Institute, it was limited by the economic technology and market environment at the time. The development of high-speed railways in China needed to be carried out in stages. Only when the conditions are right will it be possible to build a new high-speed passenger dedicated railway. During the same period, the Guangzhou Shenzhen section of the Guangzhou Kowloon Railway started the electrification renovation process, and the plan to introduce pendulous EMU trains to increase the speed to 160 kilometers per hour, making it the optimal test line for the development of quasi-high-speed railways in China. This is from the 1980s. So this segues into my main point that the socialist market economy in China is a Marxist-Leninist tool that is crucial to socialist construction. While Deng's concept and implementation of socialist market economy is a significant contribution to Marxism-Leninism, it's not without precedents. Proletarian revolution has historically broken out in countries where the chains of imperialism are the weakest. One of the uniting characteristics of these countries is backwards productive forces, underdeveloped because of decades of colonial and imperial subjugation. Far from the first instance of communists using markets to lay an industrial foundation for socialism, China's socialist market economy can be compared, or at least has the same operating logic as the new economic policy of the Bolsheviks. According to Lasordo, here is an indirect comparison between the Soviet NEP and the reform policy adopted by Deng Xiaoping in China. It is obvious what the two have in common. Total political expropriation of the bourgeoisie does not equal total economic expropriation. Of course, there are differences, and Deng Xiaoping once said, perhaps Lenin had a good idea when he adopted the new economic policy. Lenin wrote in the book in this text, The Tax in Kind, states, socialism is inconceivable without large-scale capitalist engineering based on the latest discoveries of modern science. It is inconceivable about planned state organizations which keep tens of millions of people to the strictest observance of a unified standard in production and distribution. We Marxists have always spoken of this, and it is not worthwhile wasting 2 seconds talking to people who do not understand even this. Anarchists and a good half of left socialist revolution. End quote. The history of China's socialist market reform is not without ideological, it's not without ideological precedent. Marx, Lenin, Mao, and Zhou Enlai all culminated and helped produce an experience that let Deng learn from them and apply his own unique insights and beliefs towards creating reform and opening up. So Deng is not a political mastermind that somehow one day decided, let's restore capitalism and press the capitalism button. Not how it works, and certainly not what happened in China, okay? So the most controversial question is that, is Chinese economic growth because of capitalism? People say, oh, China, state capitalist. China is revisionist. China is a capitalist nation where workers work 12 hours a day and everyone wants to kill themselves and everyone jumps from roofs and everyone is suicidal and everyone hates the CPC. However, this is simply not the case. A university paper, Is China Still Socialist, published by Ku Heiku, their research going into detail of the market share of the economy. In 2010, at least 94% of all financial capital and assets are owned by state-owned enterprises, otherwise known as public companies directly administered by the CPC in China. This means, right, that in terms of markets, not necessarily in terms of profits, because theoretically, you can have very little assets and make a large amount of profit. So let's say you're a crypto trader, right? Your financial assets are your computer and maybe one of your crypto mining setups. You can still make a decent amount of market capitalization, but your market assets, the tools you use to make your money, it can be less. So these SOEs may be less profitable or may not make as much money or may be seen as not making as much in terms of market capitalization compared to private companies. When it comes to the actual factory size, people employed, the size of how many, let's say, I don't know, let's say it's how many wind turbines they own in comparison to privately owned wind turbines. China has more. The Chinese companies are larger. And because as the largest SOEs don't necessarily operate on the profit like maxim or the law of profit. So I wouldn't be that surprised if they ultimately end up making less market capitalization. In the university paper, The Rise of the Investor State, State Capital in the Chinese Economy by Hao Chen and Meg Riffmeyer discusses how state shareholders can influence the private sector, with the overall ownership of investment firms in 2017 being 80.9% central state owned, 13.7% local state owned, and only 4.6% being truly private. The paper also goes on to state, quote, the state's role as the owner of firms has narrowed to include a set of large national champion firms at the central level. But the deployment of state capital is more formed rather than abated. As we have shown, the state invests broadly in the private sector in a number of forms, a fact that complicates the state versus private dichotomy that has dominated the study of China's political economy during the reform era. Further, the deployment of state capital into the wider economy has accompanied a change in the structure of the state. Hundreds of shareholding firms, large and small and owned by local and central levels of the state, now interface extensively with private firms. They can intervene with ease in stock markets and appear to constitute new agents in the execution of the CPC's overall economic policy, end quote. So we can clearly see that the CPC does actually maintain some form of economic and political control over the market sector and the state-owned sector. This we can clearly see this is the case. But if you still don't believe me, here is some more evidence. In an article published by The Economist titled The Rise of China's VC-industrial complex, it states, between 2015 and 2021, around 2,000 so-called government guidance funds collectively raised almost 1 trillion US dollars. Although the pace of fundraising has slowed since its peak in 2016, not least to allow the vehicles to deploy their copious dry powder, the government's role has been entrenched. Last year, the state, including local governments, accounted for one-third of all capital raised in Chinese limited partnerships, making it by far the country's biggest source of venture capital and private equity. According to Bain, a consultancy, mostly big Chinese funds that completed fundraising rounds in 2021 were government-led. The Enterprise Reforms Fund raised nearly 11 billion. The National Green Development Fund brought in 14 billion. Provinces set up 20 such vehicles last year, marshalling around 136 billion yuan all told, 4.5 times as much as they raised in 2020, according to the Zero to IPO, a research firm. End quote. Firms and investments are clearly hinged upon China and the use of state-owned capital to accelerate reform. In many cases, it is also noted that state investments crowd out private investment, in turn making the state the primary investor, with private capital getting less and less opportunities to invest. State guidelines for recognizing investment losses are often stricter than venture capitalists or private equity managers would like, and less patient towards failing firms. This means if the private firms end up failing or defaulting, the CPC simply lets them fall into the wayside and take their place using an SOE or state-owned enterprise. If a guidance fund with a small stake in a sub-fund decides to pull out, its preferential term will cause the dissolution of the entire vehicle, leaving both the portfolio firms and private investors out to dry. The same Economist article also states, beyond China's largest cities though, the situation is likely to look less like Shanghai and more like Shandong. In 2018, the Eastern Province set up a new growth drivers fund. Since then, the vehicle has launched more than 270 sub-funds, and its cash has found its way into at least 100 provincial companies. Our analysis of 50 of these sub-funds revealed that about half are dominated by state capital, with little private sector co-investment. Instead, many of the remaining limited partners are other guidance funds, state-run firms, or various government-linked entities. The individuals charged with managing these sub-funds also appear to have much less market experience than their counterparts in Shanghai. We can clearly see that the CPC is in charge of the private sector, using their investments, crowding out private investments, and once private investment has been used up, simply kick them out or leave them out to dry, filling their role with state investment instead. The movement of capital and investment itself is highly regulated, and it is complicated for wealthy entrepreneurs and corrupt government members to transfer money across borders. The statement is further elaborated on and expanded on the text The Ascendancy of the State-Owned Enterprise in China, Development, Controversy, and Problem by Hong Yu, who states, in terms of total sales revenues of China's top 100 enterprises in 2011, the SOEs accounted for around 90%. The state sector remains the total driving force behind economic development in China. All the big commercial banks in China are SOEs. More importantly, given the fact that township and village enterprises, TVEs, owned by local governments belong to the state sector but are not regarded as SOEs, and a large number of entities operating inside and outside of China are actually owned or controlled indirectly via SOE subsidiaries, the true size of the SOEs is unknown. Their influence is far greater than official statistics suggest. Wurzel's study also demonstrates that many firms, which are partially privatized but the state remaining as majority shareholder, has not been counted in SOE categories in official statistics. The township and village of enterprises, or TVEs, which are in actuality a cooperative sector of the Chinese economy, have been described as private. However, this collectively owned sector grew rapidly. In 1978, there were 1.5 million enterprises. By 1995, there were 22 million. In 1978, they employed 28 million people. By 1995, 128 million. While they have been claimed to be private, in reality, the CPC legally defines TVEs as, quote, the term township enterprises, as mentioned in this law, refers to all kinds of enterprises established in townships, including villages, under the jurisdiction, and are mainly invested by rural collective economic organization or farmers and undertake the obligation to support agriculture. The term investment base mentioned in the preceding paragraph refers to rural collective economic organizations or farmers investing more than 50% or less than 50%, but can play a controlling or actual dominating role. A township's enterprise that meets the conditions for an actual enterprise legal person to obtain the qualification of an enterprise legal person according to law. End quote. In 2014, China's top 500 companies, 300 of which being state-owned enterprises, account for 60%. The operating revenues of these state-owned enterprises account for 79.7% of the total 56.68 trillion yuan, while total assets accounts for 91.2% of the total 176.4 trillion yuan. The total profits of these SOEs account for 83.9% of the total 2.4 trillion yuan. In 2006, the report revealed that 49 enterprises in the list were state-owned, accounting for nearly 70% of the total. Their combined assets reached 39 trillion yuan at the end of 2005, accounting for 95% of the total. This demonstrates that state-owned economy remains dominant and controls the leading industries in the national economy. China has actually managed to maintain their commitment to growing and strengthening state-owned enterprises, which directly counters one of the demands of the USA at the trade war against China, which is to call for China to shrink the size of state-owned enterprises. 73% of Chinese companies listed on the Fortune 500, which are 500 times the greatest revenue in the world, are listed as SOEs. Huawei is also listed on there, but I'm not going to deem it actually private due to the nature of its ownership leaning more towards a cooperative. One way the CPC maintains control over the market sector is through the use of the CPC being a majority equity shareholder. This is elaborated on in the following article. In May 2009, directors of the Heritage Foundation explained this issue in the article called Liberalization in Reverse. He states, quote, executive companies are truly private is important because privatization is often confused the spreading out of shareholding and the sale of minority stakes. In China, 100% state ownership is often diluted by division of ownership into shares, some of which are made available to state actors, such as foreign companies or other private investors. Nearly two-thirds of state-owned enterprises and subsidiaries in China have undertaken such changes, leading some foreign observers to label these non-state or even private. But this reclassification is incorrect. The sale of stock does nothing by itself to alter state control. Dozens of enterprises are no less state-controlled simply because they are listed on foreign stock exchanges. As a practical matter, 3/4, roughly 1,500 companies listed as domestic stocks are still functionally state-owned. While the so-called privatization process, of course, allows some private ownership, Zizers makes clear this is a far cry from real privatization, which is different from the character in the USA and other capitalist countries. The state, headed by the CPC, retains a majority stake in the company and guides the company's path. More striking are the industries that remain firmly under state control, which are those industries most essential to the world of Chinese masses. Zizers continues. No matter the shareholding structure, all national corporations in these sectors that make up the core of the Chinese economy are required by law to be owned or controlled by the state. These sectors include power generation and distribution, oil, coal, petrochemicals and natural gas, telecommunications, armament, aviation and shipping, machinery and automobile production, information technologies, construction, and the production of iron, steel, and non-ferrous metals. The railroads, grain distribution, and insurance are also dominated by the state, even if no official edict says so. The same sentiment is echoed in a study called Perspectives on China's Outward Foreign Direct Investment, done by the Journal of International Business Studies, 2008. They state, of the 1,381 listed companies at the end of 2005, of all the shares outstanding, fully 65.9% are non-tradable shares. Of these, over half are owned by government and government organs, with the remainder owned by other legal entities, mostly large state-controlled enterprises or state-managed investment funds. Non-tradable shares are also inalienable. They cannot be freely bought or sold. Their existence has ensured continued state control of the economy by giving the state the majority voting power in the shareholder meetings of major listed firms. The figure may understate the total state-related equity control, as state investment funds also hold tradable shares and cross-shareholding by SOEs are also prevalent. This typical ownership structure has severe implications. First, small public shareholders have little to no influence on corporate decisions, since the state wields sufficient voting power to appoint the board of a typical listing firm. Second, listed firms do not typically pay dividends on non-tradable shares directly owned by the state. Even if they pay dividends on other classes of tradable and non-tradable shares, naturally, vested interests within the state organs are seen as high dividend as undesirable, because they have 100% of the control if the earnings are retained but little to gain once they're distributed. No capitalist country in the history of the world has ever had state control over all these industries. Yes, this even includes Nazi Germany and the Asian Tigers and fascist Italy. In countries like the United States or France, certain industries like railroads and health insurance may have state ownership, but it falls drastically of dominating the industry. The importance of this widespread state ownership is that the essential aspects of the Chinese economy as run by the state are headed by a party whose orientation is towards the working class and peasantry. Particularly damaging to the China as state capitalist argument is the status of banks and the financial system. This elaborates. The state exercises control over most of the rest of the economy through the financial system, especially the banks. By the end of 2008, outstanding loans amounted to almost 5 trillion US dollars, and annual loan growth was almost 90% and accelerating. Lending, in other words, is probably China's principal economic force. The Chinese state owns all the large financial institutions, and the People's Bank of China assigns them loan quotas every year, and lending is directed according to the state's priorities. End quote. Unlike the West and capitalist or corporatist economies, China has not privatized their finance industries or investment industries. If you do research into Russia or fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, or Japan, their banking industries, their largest banking industries, were not nationalized. Their insurance was not nationalized. This is a definitively different character, which also means state and joint venture bonds are less valuable compared to private bonds. Also, there may be elements of state planning within the private sectors or run by the private companies, like the Mifo Group in Nazi Germany, for example, or the Keiretsu in Japan, or the Chaebol in South Korea. Here's the difference, though. The planning is done by capitalists, not by the proletariat state. Therefore, the nature of planning is different, and the nature of the banking system and lending system is different, which I will elaborate on. And so, the People's Bank of China highlights one of the most important ways in which the CPC uses the market system to control private capital and subordinate to socialism. Far from functioning as a capitalist national bank, which prioritizes facilitating the accumulation of capital by the bourgeoisie, according to Derek Scissors, this system frustrates private borrowers. The CPC floods the market with public bonds, which has a crowding out effect on private corporate bonds that firms use to raise independent capital. Another example of this would be how there's a strong price cap on how much money you can move in and out of the country, but cap on the outflow and inflow of wealth to external bank accounts being around 20,000 to 50,000 US dollars, making the control of investment in and out of the country subordinate to the CPC. This also renders state bonds far more valuable than private bonds, and credit deterioration of non-state bonds is worse than state bonds. State-owned enterprises receive much more preferential treatment from the government due to this model of flooding state bonds and more valuable assets in the market, with comparable private ones declining in terms of value and being unable to compete. In 2018, this is clearly demonstrated after the implementation of more regulations on the shadow banking market, leading to investors flocking towards a much more stable and valuable state bond over private ones. This inevitably creates a feedback loop where the state bonds have more premiums and objectively more valuable than private ones. This is elaborated in the study The SOE Premium and Government Support in China's Credit Market by Zhe Geng and Jun Pan in November 29, 2002. By harnessing supply and demand in the bond market, PVC prevents private firms, domestic or foreign, from accumulating capital independently of socialist ends. In another way that the CPC maintains control over the private sector is through the use of party committees and party units. A survey conducted in 2006 investigated 400 private enterprises in 26 provinces. Only 9% of all respondents believe that party committees held no or a weak sway over decision making. In the Contemporary Manager Journal, 2006, from China. Another study called Perspectives on China's Outwards Foreign Direct Investment by the Journal of International Businesses Studies 2008 states the state appointed independent directors often see the world much as do state appointed CEOs. Moreover, every listed firm's board has a parallel authority structure, the firm's party committee, headed by its Communist Party secretary. Reforms to the board leave this hidden or not so hidden real power structure untouched. The party secretary may or may not chair the board, and the party committee members may or may not serve as directors. Where the top two structures do not overlap, real power flows through the party channels, leaving the board and formal corporate top executives with little real authority. In the large state-owned enterprises, the party secretary appoints top executives and directors, often simply relaying orders from the Communist Party of China's organizational development and exercises a leading role in the company. And the ultimate function of the party committee and party secretaries may change as corporate governance reform occurs, but this remains unresolved. For example, whether listed companies' managers might someday report to shareholders rather than party is debated. At the present, the party committee monitors and evaluates corporate executives, determining their prospects for career advancement. The CEO of the largest 53 national SOEs are appointed directly by the Communist Party of China's organizational department. The other senior management department is mostly appointed by the State-owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, which is directed by the State Council. Similar patterns are the same for local state-owned enterprises. In November 2004, the top managers of the three largest telecommunication companies in China, China Mobile, China Telecom, and China Unicom, exchanged positions almost overnight without prior notice to public shareholders. In short, executive positions in listed firms are filled by state party bureaucrats and are seen as a step in the career of a successful civil servant. End quote. So to put it simply, even if a company is on the public shareholder market, the ultimate decision-making power at the highest level comes from the CPC. This is how the CPC exerts power and influence over the private sector, even though the sale of stock and the sale of shares into the private market is permitted. And as explained in previous arguments, the vast majority of shares all end up in the hands of the CPC anyway, considering that more often than not, the CPC maintains the largest equity shareholder. Even if it doesn't, the use of the CPC party committees and shells ensure compliance and control over these private companies. The role of the party committees are further elaborated upon by Trey McGarver, co-founder of consultancy Trivium/China, which advises companies working in China who states no company, private or state-owned, gets ahead in China while aligning itself with the party's larger goals and strategies. That is more the case than ever in Xi's China. Xi Jinping has reasserted the centrality of the party in all facets of society, including within the economy. Although modern China has an expansive market system, the CPC uses the market to secure and advance socialism. Rather than privatizing major industries as is often alleged by distractors, the state maintains a vibrant system of socialist public ownership that prevents the rise of independent bourgeoisie class. If the small and medium-sized enterprises were state-owned, and the largest companies and banks were private-owned, and if the banks lent almost exclusively to large private companies, it is quite clear that China would be a capitalist economy, even if the majority of workers worked in state-owned companies. But this is the opposite of which exists in China. Western analysts seem to believe the CPC has accomplished the goal. The capitalist Australia-based Centre for Independent Studies, CIS, has published a July 2008 article that says that those who think China is becoming a capitalist country misunderstand the structure of the Chinese economy, which largely remains a state-dominated system. The article elaborates. By strategically controlling economic resources and remaining the primary dispenser of economic opportunity and success in Chinese society, the Chinese Communist Party is building institutions and supporters that seem to be entrenching the party's monopoly on power. Indeed, in many ways, reforms in the country's economic growth actually enhance the CCP's ability to remain in power. Rather than being swept away by change, the CCP is in many ways its agent and beneficiary. End quote. The CIS also states that the SOEs accounts for 71% of total Chinese firms on the list of the largest of 500 of the Fortune 500 companies, but represent 78% of total revenue and 84% of all assets from Chinese entrants to the list. They claim that the SOEs are highly unprofitable and don't operate on the law of profit, but instead on the logic of asset maximization. Absolute state control over those SOEs and the massive amount of assets that they hold shows that Chinese SOEs behave like asset maximizers, not profit maximizers. This indicates that the commanding heights of the economies, otherwise known as SOEs, are still very much operating off of socialist logic and not capitalist logic. And if you go over the true nature of the private sector, it is actually quite small once you take into account its breaking down when it comes to assets and employees. In 2005, the private sector is dominated by small-sized enterprises. Only 5% of the private enterprises employ more than 500, and only 2% more than 1,000 workers. Contrast this to the state sector, where 80% of workers work in companies employing over 500 workers, and the number of private companies rose from 90,000 in 98, employing 1.4 million workers, to 3.6 million companies in 2004, employing over 40 million workers. However, 74% of these private companies originated as new startups. 7% are privatized state-owned companies, 8% are privatized rural collectives, and 11% are privatized urban collectives. The average income of an entrepreneur is $6,600 per year, 2002 figures. This gives an idea of a small scale of the overwhelming majority of private sector enterprise in China. However, keep this in mind, right? When they say the state-owned companies or the rural collectives or the urban collectives are privatized, as I have explained already, simply because your stock is held by a private company or is listed on the domestic stockholder market does not make you private. Even though people would love to count it or would like to count it as private, this is not the case. As I have explained, the CPC and the state maintains majority shareholder in the vast majority of these companies. So, while the CIS goes on to discuss the lack of economic and political freedom in China, and these documents say the exact same thing, the Marxist-Leninists should read between the lines and know the truth. China isn't capitalist. The CPC isn't pursuing capitalist development, and the socialist market economy has succeeded in laying the material foundation for quote-unquote higher state socialism. We can clearly see that with the commanding heights of the Chinese economy, that China remains socialist and a Marxist-Leninist nation. The claims that China has restored a capitalist road is fundamentally untrue. Opening up to the foreign world has objectively led to development. China's opening up to foreign investment and its integration into global markets is often presented by some leftists as the primary evidence that China has become a capitalist country. China's joining of the World Trade Organization in 2001 was seen as the death blow to socialism in China. However, this is not the case. Jenny Clegg explains that World Trade Organization members has nothing to do with capitalist restoration and everything to do with developing China's productive forces and strengthening its geopolitical position, and thereby building a better life for its people. China joined the World Trade Organization in order to be able to, quote, insert itself in the global production chain linking East Asia to the US and other markets, thus making it indispensable as a production base for the world economy. This would make it far more difficult for the United States to impose a new Cold War isolation. This means that the unprecedented global technological revolution, offering a shortcut for the country to accelerate its industrial transformation and upgrade its economic structure, end quote, found in Jenny Clegg's book, China's Global Strategy Toward a Multipolar World, Pluto Press, 2009. The opportunity to rapidly learn from the advanced capitalist countries' developments in science technology was the principal reason for opening up. Based on Zhou Enlai's principles of foreign modernization, located by the Western countries after the revolution, and then cut off from Soviet support as a result of the Sino-Soviet split, China in 1978 was objectively technologically backward. Despite it having made some great advances and having developed a standard of living for its people that was far ahead of other countries at a similar level of development. Deals with foreign investors were drawn up such that foreign companies trying to expand their capital in China were compelled to share skills and technology and operate under Chinese regulation. According to David Rosnick, Mark Weisbrot, and Jacob Wilson on the text The Scorecard on Development, 1960 to 2016, China Economic Rebound, published in 2019, foreign investment was regulated to make it compatible with state development planning, technology transfer, and other foreign investment. Conditions attached to foreign investment made sure that the host country gets some benefits from foreign investment, such as the use of locally produced inputs or the hiring of local managers, were common and are still an issue of contention with the United States today. End quote. Martin Jack states in his book, When China Rules the World, The Rise of the Middle Kingdom and the End of the Western World, states, as China has grown more powerful, the demand for technology transfers has become ever insistent, with foreign companies, complain though they may, excuse me, generally conceding. And Peter Nolan states in his book, China's Rise, Russia's Fall. In order to gain access to the vast and rapidly growing China's market, Boeing was required to assist the main Chinese aircraft manufacturer, CN, to successfully establish a capacity to produce spare parts and then manufacture whole sections of aircraft, and finally assist in the development of a capacity to produce complete aircraft within China. In order to gain the right to invest in car production in China, Ford Motor Company was required to first invest for several years in upgrading technical capacity of the Chinese automobile spare parts industry through a sequence of joint ventures. End quote. China also bars many foreign companies from participating in the Chinese market. As a result, Chinese companies need to enter the market of other means, such as setting up a wholly foreign joint enterprise, or primarily through forming a joint venture with a Chinese business partner. It is alleged that Chinese joint ventures and Chinese companies tend to steal IP and technology from these foreign companies, as demonstrated in the above quotes. And many foreign investors have also stated there are no legal protections for these foreign companies, and Chinese attorneys will lobby in favor of the state. This indicates that foreign companies clearly do not run amok in China. Many foreign investors have complained about the lack of freedom in the Chinese market, the state being the ultimate deciding factor in cases. This is stated by Harris Brickett on the China Law blog. So, the socialist market economy and socialism with Chinese characteristics has allowed China to rise to unprecedented economic heights. While the Great Leap Forward was an ambitious attempt at laying the industrial foundation necessary to build socialism, the facts are in. China's GDP in 1960 after the GLF was 59.72 billion. In 2009, China's GDP sits at 5,101 billion, making it the second largest economy in the world. In other words, the modern Chinese economy is about 89 times the size of its economy following the Great Leap Forward. Ironically, the capitalists admire yet despise the success of the socialist market economy. They hate China's commitment to socialism, but cannot deny its successes. Zizzers admits in the same Heritage Foundation article that between June 2002 and June 2008, China's GDP more than tripled and its exports more than quadrupled. He also states, The rapid GDP growth has created jobs. By the end of June 2008, unemployment rate among registered urban voters was a mere 4%, even lower than the government's ambitious target of 4.5%. That figure may understate true joblessness by ignoring rural and unregistered urban employment, but it accurately reflects the trends in the broader job situation. So many migrant workers from urban rural areas were absorbed in the urban labor force that 20 million of such workers reported to have lost their jobs in late 2008, still left well over 100 million rural migrants of jobs in cities. End quote. The CPC also has allowed for greater workers' wages and increase in said wages. This also states urban wages have climbed significantly by 18% between 2009 and 2008. This also leads to my point that China is not capitalist because it doesn't demonstrate the tendency of the rate of profit fall. Take the modern example. The capitalist class would choose less labor intensive and cheaper methods to try and maximize profit, causing a decrease in wages. This causes overall wages and disposable income to decrease, causing workers behind being unable to pay for more goods and services. This leads the capitalists to end up not being able to profit due to the lack of workers being able to afford your product. This is the inevitable nature of capitalism. Except this doesn't happen in China. As demonstrated previously, job rates and wages have continued to increase. As I mentioned previously in this talk, Richard D. Wolff already explained that the China real wage has gone up 4 times the past 25 years more than any other country, and that once you account for disposable income, it has increased 1,000% in 2002 and 2002. Continuing steadily to climb, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is not demonstrated in China, as China has continued to industrialize and increase globalization. Successful elevation of the Chinese socialist market economy has led to a basis of allowing higher socialism in the form of socialist economic organization. The market is not a mode of production, rather a form of economic organization. Deng explains this distinction well in a lecture he gave in 1992, which states, the proportion of planning to productive forces is not the essential difference between socialism and capitalism. A planned economy is not equivalent to socialism, because there's planning under capitalism too. A market economy is not capitalism, because there are markets under socialism too. Planning and market forces are both means of controlling economic activity. End quote. Markets are neither capitalist nor socialist, because economic planning is neither capitalist nor socialist. Both of these forms of economic organizations are just tools in a toolbox, and in some cases, they are the most useful ones. For 30 years, the CPC has successfully used markets for more than 30 years. The CPC has successfully used markets as a tool for revolutionizing the country's productive forces. Precisely because of this success, the state is rapidly moving towards more advanced forms of socialist industrial organization to replace the market mechanism. Deng explains this in a talk delivered to the Central Committee in May 1980 entitled On the Questions of Rural Policy. He states that it is certain that as long as production expands, the division of labor increases, and the commodity economy develops, lower forms of collectivization in the countryside will develop into higher forms, and the collective economy will acquire a firm basis. The key task is to expand the productive forces and thereby create conditions for the further development of collectivization. End quote. After 30 years of practice, Deng Xiaoping's statement have come true. In 2006, the CPC announced a revolutionary overhaul of the Chinese countryside and pledged to use just China's newly acquired wealth to transform rural areas into what President Hu Jintao called a new socialist countryside. China's new rural policy promises sustained increases in farmer income, more industrial support for agriculture, and faster development of public services. Additional provisions allow peasant students to receive free textbook and boarding subsidies, and the state will increase subsidies for rural health cooperatives, thanks to a 2000 law strengthening rural cooperatives. This has led to 48% of all rural households by 2018 being a part of a cooperative. And as a way to increase agricultural efficiency through integration, both horizontal and vertical, by combining small farms with larger, more efficient entities, and by bringing together the production, processing, storage, transportation, and sales into one industrial chain. In the process, agricultural officials hope to transform the country's scattered landholders into large-scale farms, realize economies of scale, and improve farmer bargaining power. In 2017, there were 3,281 village-level supply and marketing cooperatives, 2,402 county-level federations of SMTs, 342 city-level federations of SMTs, 32 provincial level federation of SMCs, and 2,852 cooperative enterprise and 280 cooperative institutes were represented by the All China Federation of Supply and Marketing Cooperatives. There were 3.4 million employees in all SMCs represented by the All China Federation of Supply and Marketing Cooperatives. And under Xi Jinping's administration, about 95% of towns and villages have an SMC as of 2019, compared to 50% from the year 6 years prior. Massive state investment in agriculture infrastructure is a quote significant shift away from the previous goals of economic development. Because of the successive modernization, a greater weight will be given to the redistribution of resources and rebalancing of income. The CPC has harnessed the market as a means to generating an industrial base to build higher socialism. On healthcare, Austin Ramsey of Time magazine reported in April 2009 China is laying out the plan to dramatically reform its healthcare system by expanding coverage for hundreds of millions of farmers, migrant workers, and city residents. These plans consist of spending 125 billion over the next 3 years, building thousands of clinics and hospitals with expanding basic healthcare coverage to 90% of the population. China's move back towards public healthcare is the logical possession of the more modernized and expansive healthcare system achieved through 30 years of the socialist market economy. Far from abandoning Chinese workers in the pursuit of modernization, the CPC announced the draft labor contract law in 2006 to protect the rights of workers employed by foreign corporations by ensuring severance pay and outlawing the non-contract labor that makes their job possible. Viciously opposed by Walmart and other Western companies, quote, foreign companies are attacking the legislation not because it provides workers with little protection, but because it provides them too much, end quote. Nevertheless, the draft labor contract law, which requires employers to contribute to the employee's social securities and set wage standards for workers on probation and overtime, was enacted in January of 2008. Turning to the macroeconomic situation, the China application of the socialist market economy has led to serious disparities in income. While undoubtedly an effect of lower socialism, or the primary stage of socialism, the Chinese state takes its contradiction very seriously and announced an unprecedented government spending campaign in March 2011 aiming to close the income gap. By increasing public spending by 12.5% in 2012, the CPC will allocate enormous government resources for education, job creation, low-income housing, healthcare, and pensions, and other social insurance. And under Xi Jinping's administration, the Zhejiang economic model is spearheaded by cooperatives and cooperative growth. The cooperative sector continues to grow. China's supply and marketing system will realize sales of agricultural products of 2.7591 trillion yuan and daily necessities of 1.4925 trillion yuan, a year-on-year increase of 24.3% and 17.1% respectively. A recruitment note has stated that in 2023, the All China Federation of Supply and Marketing Cooperative plans to take the examination of recruit staff for the agency. Outstanding young people who are interested in joining the supply and marketing cooperative are welcome to apply for examination. The correct position on China requires, above all else, a holistic examination of the country's economy placed within the context of CPC's path towards modernization. Focusing too much on China's market economy and its defects clouds the most important fact, which is that the working class and peasantry still rule China through the CPC, and the success of the modernization via the market economy has paved the way for higher socialism.